Today we are going to start a series. It's still part of the establishing of a monarchy. It's still part of the original series. But I have to stop and tackle this first. I was going to talk about how the Assyrians came into the picture. But to do that from a purely historical perspective, I have to kind of reset and shed some light on a forgotten kingdom, strictly from a historical perspective. This intro was supposed to have been next week, but I had to wake up early this morning to actually put this together because I was stuck when I was preparing my notes for today. I was stuck in a sense that I was filtering too much. I had to put filters on what I was saying. In my notes, and it was making it too difficult. It wasn't flowing like I wanted it to flow. So it dawned on me that, you know what? It will be a better approach to talk about this and then come back to the Solomon and David narration or narrative or tales or stories and continue from there. Because without it, it's going to be, I'll paint a picture that is not actually, or that wouldn't be the reality that was on the ground. And then in doing that, I would be turning on the light on the Northern Kingdom in a way that you may not have heard before. The Northern Kingdom has been put into the shadow of Judah. And that should not be the case. It should be the other way round. But obviously the one with the pen, and because of the absence of the North, I was going to personalize it and say because of our absence, the person with the pen told a story which, if I'm bold enough to say, is false. So we want to kind of set the record straight. I will be saying a lot of things that may shock you. I may review a lot of things that I think we've gone past that place where you want to throw the book away. I think we've gone through past that place. But if somebody is still there, please don't do that yet. I'm going to be blunt. I would give the data as it is. And maybe we may have to do some aftercare if it's needed. But that is how raw I'm going to give the data. It's not to challenge anyone who subscribes to Judah. It's not to bring an internal civil war between the tribes. But I think it's a history that should be known. Because it's about time. We the North is the series. We're going to see the Northern Kingdom in its glory. It puts Judah as a village somewhere. But they had a pen, so they put us in the shadows. But let's set the record straight. We've been talking about the establishment of a monarchy, and we started the narrative from Saul, how Saul became king, how he lost his kingdom, how David comes into the picture, how we are told he ruled over all of Israel. Solomon comes into the picture. We are told about his wisdom, about the temple that he built, etc. And we came to the place of introducing the Assyrians into the picture. I want to go back and do a recap and then speak the same thing that we've done from Saul to Solomon, put it in a purely historical context. You would ask, have we not been doing historical? Yes, we have been, but it hasn't been purely historical. Historical meaning that not being influenced by what the biblical text says, but looking at history, looking at archaeology as well. What we can reconstruct or what we can construct about what really took place in this territory that we call Israel. We introduced to David and Solomon, and they are portrayed as human beings, sometimes semi-human beings. Why do I say that? David and Solomon, the portrayal that we get, are portrayed as having great flaws, as intense as their God-given gifts. This is what we get. The biblical portraits of David and Solomon are oversized. When you listen to them, when you read about them, when you hear them, they are unforgettable. And they are painted in very bright colors. We notice that these narratives, these tales, these stories are filled with human and theological contradictions. Some may question, which we've done, which scholarship has done. And even with these questions, the oversized pictures that is painted never look any small. They stay oversized. It's hard to come to terms knowing that David did not kill Goliath. It was Elkanah. Why is it? Even though the stories are filled with human and theological contradictions, yet God's promise of eternal protection to David and to all his descendants offer the hope that someday a new David or Solomon will arise to usher in a new and even more breathtaking golden age, meaning that the tales tell of a story of hope. In the future, something will get better. In the future, there will be a restoration. When such stories are told to people who need hope, it's very difficult for them to come to terms with the reality that was actually on the ground. In our studies, we have attempted to separate history from myth. Old memories from later embellishments. We've done that. Facts from royal propaganda. We did that. to trace the evolution of the David and Solomon narrative from its ancient origins to the final compilation of the biblical accounts. We've done that. We've spent a lot of time doing that. And what did we see? We saw the tension between historical fact and sanctified tradition. When we take these two individuals, the ancient person sees them differently. The Judeo-Christian tradition sees them differently. And today, in the 21st century, we see them differently. David and Solomon, to the ancient one, or to the ancient people, to ancient Israel, were founding fathers. They founded what became Judah. Or the South. They were founding fathers. In the eyes of the Judeo-Christian tradition, as it evolved and expanded, they became great leaders, spiritual forerunners. They became princes and then monarchs. They made such an impact. Take Moshe. Moshe and Abraham did not make such an impact. You would think Moshe will make such an impact, even if, maybe Abraham, but Moshe, you would think he would have made such an impact. But no, Abraham, the great patriarch, slept peacefully in his tomb in Hebron. Moshe, the great lawgiver, would never return again. But what made David and Solomon stand out? It was because the tales told was that they were the recipients of a divine promise that ensured the people's survival and eventual redemption. Tales told. I want to call them tales. We'll look at 4 prophecies that set these in stones, and will show that those are not prophecies. A prophecy has to be said before the fact. We will demonstrate that they were not before the fact. It was people taking advantages of something that had already happened, and they are writing them down as prophecies. But this is what made these two people stand out. They were the recipient of a divine promise according to the tales and stories told. They offered a promise for the future, no matter how grim the past might seem. And we read this beautifully, beautifully written that you can even memorize it. I mean, the literature is so perfect, perfectly written, and we know it offhand. We come to Isaiah 11 and we read, "A shoot shall grow out of the stump of Jesse. A twig shall sprout from his stalk. The spirit of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh shall alight upon him," or rest upon him, "the spirit of wisdom and insight, a spirit of counsel and valor, a spirit of devotion and reverence for Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. He shall sense the truth by his reverence for Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. He shall not judge by what his eyes behold, nor decide by what his ears perceive. Thus he shall judge the poor with equity, and decide with justice for the lowly of the land. He shall strike down a land with the rod of his mouth, and slay the wicked with the breath of his lips. Justice shall be the girdle of his loins, and faithfulness the girdle of his waist. This is what the people held on. This is the hope fueled these tales that gave hope for the future. That hope fueled Judean expectations for centuries. That hope for Christianity, this messianic promise that David accepted in Christianity, was inherited by Jesus or Yeshua. This hope made Islam afford a place in their tradition as great kings and wise judges who carried out Allah's will. It means that without these two and the tales told by them, our world would be different. Without these two and then tales told about them, our world would have been different. If these tales were not there, we'd be looking at a completely different world. Their narrative even offers a template for leadership, mostly Western leadership, and prototype of kingly power. You cannot talk about kings and not mention David and Solomon. But little did you know that you cannot even compare them to Omri's dynasty. Cannot compare. Cannot compare them to the north. It's not even fair to put them next to the north. It would be an insult to the north. So these familiar narratives, these familiar stories about David and Solomon, based on a few early folk traditions, when it started, it was quite simple. It's based on 10th century folk traditions. But they are the result of extensive reworking and editorial expansion during the 4 centuries that followed David and Solomon's reign. You have something that starts very small, locally, in a very small territory. And then 4 centuries after the original tales, we see extensive reworking, expansion, editing of the tales that a small group of villagers would have told. Although the tales we have them today, although they contain little reliable history, we still hold them so dear. Many of the famous episodes in the biblical story of David and Solomon are fictions. They are historically questionable or highly exaggerated. We saw most of that. I do subscribe to the fact that David and Solomon were historical. They were actually historical characters, but they were very different from their scriptural portrayals or their scriptural portraits. Very different. We see extortion in their narratives, seduction, deception, righteous violence. These are methods that we saw David use. We didn't hear such stories about Saul. We saw that modest events were transformed into astonishing achievements. Personal traits are exaggerated to a mythical scale. This is what we get. But if we go back, where can we start from? What is our starting point to really see the historical and archaeological portrait of David, Solomon, the kingdom of Judah, and then Israel? What is the precise date of the reign of these two? Before we decipher that, are there any questions and comments?
Nah, Rabbi, we don't have any questions off that. And truthfully, to be honest, I don't even think majority of us would know the right questions to ask. So right now, we just taking it all in and processing it. Well, me personally, I'm just taking it all in, processing it. And then when the questions come up, then I'll be able to ask. But right now, I wouldn't even know what to ask. So I'm just taking notes.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. Today is just an introduction, setting the stage for the snowball next week. So what is the precise date of their reign? Where can we put them? Because putting them in the correct century helps us a lot. Now, in doing that, we must rely with great caution. Why do I say great caution? Because we're going to rely on the chronological clues preserved in the biblical text by the Deuteronomistic historian. We're going to rely on that, but as we all know, it has to be with great caution. Why is that? Because we do not possess any contemporary references to David and Solomon on well-dated inscriptions from archaeological excavations in Israel or from the neighboring civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia. We have nothing. So we have to depend on the book that we are trying to figure out and say, why did you portray us this way? We have to rely on that cautiously to come up, or to rely on their chronological clues that they preserved. But we can do that, luckily, and again, cautiously. When we come to 2 Kings 25, we read, in the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim of Judah, on the 27th day of the 12th month, King Evil-Merodach of Babylon, in the year he became king, took note of King Jehoiakim of Judah and released him from prison. Why is this verse important? Well, 1st and 2nd Kings I'm reading Mr. Mark's comment in the chat. Okay, First and Second Kings, in most cases, give us some information about these kings. It notes or it writes or it informs us about the king's age at assuming the throne. It gives us the length of his reign and then the correspondence in years and duration to the reigning king from the rival kingdom. So you look at the kings of the north, and then you can say, okay, this king in the south reigned when this guy reigned here, or when this guy reigned, or 3 days and 7 days and was dethroned, all of that. So because First Kings and Second Kings gives us this data, it helps us to calculate backward from the last reference to a king of the Davidic dynasty. When we do that, we are fairly secure to come up with a starting point. Hope you understand what I just said.
So basically, you're saying is that I'm sorry. Basically, you're saying you're establishing a date that is known so that we can cross-reference it and find the approximate date.
Correct. Yes, that's what I am saying. We get very good information of the last king of Judah mentioned. We are told who was ruling in Babylon when he came on the stage. We have the length or the duration of when these kings ruled. So when we go backwards, it gives us a fairly good century to put David, Solomon, and Saul. The text also gives us a name. It gives us the name of a Babylonian king, but it calls him evil Merodach. That is not his name. His name is Amaah Marduk, and he ascended the throne in 561 BCE. So the mention in 2 Kings of the release from the Babylonian captivity of the last surviving Davidic king, Jehoiakim, in the first year of this Babylonian ruler, Amaah Marduk, helps us with the dating as well. But I must say again, we are dealing with the text. We are not outside of the biblical text. We are inside the text. So, proper account has to be taken for conflicting evidence from other ancient Near Eastern sources, obvious scribal errors, suspiciously round numbers. You know, when they round the number, this person ruled for 40 a generation. Maybe the person ruled for 30 years, but they rounded up to a generation of 40. We have to consider all of that. And then the possible overlap in the rule of kings and their successors. You know, when we put all this into consideration, we've been able to construct a chronological sequence that stretches all the way back to David and Solomon. And it puts them in the 10th century. And that would be the starting point of David and then Solomon. these two most important in Judean history.
Rabbi,
Mr. David.
sorry about that. Just to confirm these dates, right? We come up with these dates by cross-reference the information that the Torah gives us with outside information, like the verse you just had. It gave us the dude in Babylon that was reigning, so we could cross-reference what they told us with the Babylonian records itself to come back to the 10th century by working all the way back.
Correct, yes. And also considering the Assyrian sources, where you have the Northern Kingdom mentioned a lot. It shows us the kings that interacted with them. So using the kings from the north and matching it with the kings that ruled in the south at that time, yes, we have a very good chance of dating the century where we should put these two.
Okay. It makes sense.
And the archaeological finds actually bears record to that as well.